Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast.
The podcast that hopes to bring a national discussion on the differing intersections of the fight to end gun violence. This is your host, Elijah Nichols.
And Addison Moore.
From DC.
Welcome to Root Causes.
Today, we will be discussing prison and police abolition in the fight to end gun violence with myself. Us, yes. Oh my gosh, I'm so greedy. We're literally having an episode to talk about prison and police abolition, and I said myself.
Wow.
I know.
Elijah.
How dare I?
Cannot believe.
I thought we were going to do like a little introduction moment, like myself, Elijah, me, Addison. But
Give the people what they want. Yeah.
You are hearing it correctly. This is an episode between Addison and myself. We view that this is a conversation that should have been in spaces a long time ago, specifically in gun violence prevention spaces. So we wanted to have this conversation between two Not My Generation organizers, two people who've engaged in this discussion many times over. So yes, welcome, Addison, to your weekly routine.
Oh my gosh, I know. It's good to always be here. Like Elijah said, we kind of wanted to talk about, GVP work and how police and prison abolition kind of is a part of that and included in that process. Because what was it? December in late 2019, right at the beginning of me starting on the board, I remember me and you talking about wanting to have conversations around different movements and kind of like how they impacted gun violence. And we thought a webinar was going to be like a fantastic way to do that. We were like, oh my gosh, this is going to be great. So easy peasy. It's going to be great. People are going to learn so much. And our first conversation we wanted to tackle was police and prison abolition, which is honestly the reason why Root Causes started, because we realized that, there was a need to have these conversations about different movements. So it's kind of surreal to see kind of the topic that started this whole thing come to life and really us have a chance to have those conversations we kind of had it together with our listeners.
Absolutely. And to think about how far we've sort of come as individuals, as organizers. I mean, we've been doing internal trainings since February on police and prison abolition because we knew it was something that we had to educate ourselves on first, like in a very in-depth, full way, before we sort of talk about it in a very public way. Because often we see people, especially activists, we see activists spew out like words or knowledge when they don't internalize that struggle, So I'm glad to be in space with you to sort of have this needed discussion in the gun violence prevention movement.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really great conversation. And, it's exciting for it to be the OG host,
Amen. So I guess we should sort of break it down for people. So from our experience doing this work in GVP spaces, in getting involved in this space with police and prison abolition, Addison, what do you view police and prison abolition to be?
Really for me, I think it's not necessarily just ending police and prisons, but really finding solutions and systems that really, care about the well-being of people and kind of the rehabilitation. Because I think the idea, as I know it and as I understand it, is really about punishment and then reform. But reform doesn't necessarily look like integrating a person back into society. Reform means to get them to understand to just follow the law, which is two very different things. And so it really is just reimagining these systems in a way that promote someone who may or may not have committed a crime, but to be able to be put back in society. Because I think it's important to understand that when we're thinking of abolition, it's not just about getting rid of, but reimagining and creating systems that truly care about the individuals that it's supposed to be serving.
Absolutely. And I think it's crucial to not even focus on the individual, but focus how when a person is forced into prison because they broke a supposed law, I think it comes down to when we're talking about police and prison abolition. It's really about tackling, for lack of a better term, those root causes, what lead individuals to commit certain crimes. And I hate even using that term because why does crime have such that heavy-handed meaning to it? When the state gets to define it, when we know the state itself, the United States of America, is rooted in the subjugation of so many different people, specifically Black and brown individuals, of Indigenous peoples, of queer identity too, of gender identity. Something that I learned when I did a lot of research on this, when I was trying to internalize what all of this meant, to break down really what the police state has brought to me, how it has affected individuals and how it has affected our communities. I sort of realized that when we're talking about police and prison abolition, it is about breaking down the divides between individuals, breaking down a hierarchy, understanding that every single person is a human. They have the same capacity, they have that same worth that every other individual has. We are a collective meant to care for one another. Everything we do impacts another. And when we put someone else in prison because they committed a supposed crime, when they committed an act against the state, rather, we need to ask why they did it. And we need to internalize that struggle, because if there is someone in prison, when there is someone in prison that is harmed by the state, and I think as gun violence prevention organizers, we really need to understand this deeply. So I'm grateful, again, to be having this conversation with you, because there's so many layers we have to peel back. Because like you
Hmm.
said, it's about harming the individual, but we can't separate that individual from the collective, because we all interact with one another. We are in community with one another constantly. But prisons and police, they break down at that. They break down at our humanity. They break down at the collective. They pit one another against each other. They create a hierarchy of the good doers and the wrongdoers. And as police and prison abolitionists, like, we don't agree with that whatsoever.
And I think that when we're talking about abolition, especially, it can be really important to understand that it's hard to try and kind of fix a system that's built to be broken, especially if you think of police in America. Like, their purpose has been and always will be property. Because if you think about how the police are even rooted, it's they were created in response to catching slaves, essentially. And when you have a system like that, that's how it began. How can you expect it to do any good when the goal was to harm individuals that it still does to this day? And in response to not being able to continue to have that free labor, to find another way to put those black bodies to work without it being deemed as slavery. But essentially, we just produced another modern day slavery, which is
Mm-hmm.
how, prisons work now.
What you just said right there, I think, is crucial for listeners, for people in the gun violence prevention movement to understand, is that the commodification of Black lives is the root of police and prison abolition, because, as you mentioned, the reforms date all the way back to slavery. Like you said, like Angela Davis summed it up pretty greatly. I watched a speech by her many, many months ago where she said the reforms of slavery, when that was deemed unacceptable, it was prisons, it was police, it was the commodification of livelihoods, still of Black livelihoods, Black movement, of Indigenous movement, really, the sectioning off of territory and, like you said, property. So I think that context is super, super crucial.
Yeah, and especially when we're thinking of how these systems are built, it's really hard. There are so many great activists that you can like quote when you think of police and prison abolition. I'm thinking of, I think it's Audre Lorde, who said like you can't dismantle the oppressor's house like with its own tools. Or
Amen.
that is really bad. I
Yeah.
said it really terribly, but I see that quote all the time, and I think it's really important to think about, especially in the context of abolition work, because you can't reform the police, you can't reform prisons, because they were never meant to be reformed. They were meant to harm and hurt the same bodies that they've been doing for its entire existence. And so for me, when I think of doing abolitionist work, I think people assume that there's no what next, but there's always a what next. That's kind of
Absolutely.
the goal of abolition, is to get to that what next. And when I think of that what next in my abolitionist work, it's really thinking, okay, we don't have prisons and police anymore. So
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? Because I think also there's a large structural, can't even say crack, like it's broken wide open, like torn to pieces kind of way that we are caring for our citizens and caring for our people in our communities. And it's never been necessarily about the care of our community members, but it's really been to perpetuate systems that, continue to and will and have like just historically damaged black and brown bodies, taking these people away from homes, taking away their right to vote, like thinking of the ways that, prison and how police kind of interact with communities. It's never really to be there to support, it's always to be there to harm. Why would I want to fix that? Like, why do I want to try and fix that system?
Mm-hmm.
And why not instead think of a system that will actually benefit the community and benefit the
Absolutely.
people who commit crimes. Because even then, again, like you said earlier, you have to think about the why. Because crime isn't the issue for me, because I
Mhm.
think that there's always a chance to rehabilitate someone, right?
Absolutely.
And that's from crimes like robbery to murder. I saw a quote recently that I think it's important to know is that, people can cause harm, right? Like
Mhm.
all of us in some sort of way could have and may have harmed someone. And that doesn't automatically make us bad people. And I think that when a bad deed is able to strip away your humanity, it's a really hard concept to understand. But having that kind of like radical love is
Mhm.
not easy, especially in a world that was never built to kind of show that type of love. So
Absolutely.
for me, I think abolition, when thinking of how it differs from reform, is really taking this definition of love and applying it to the community and
Mhm.
figuring out what does it mean when I'm loving a community member? What does it mean when I am in community with someone and harm is done? Because I think it can be really challenging to think of that because it's like,
Mhm.
well, someone hurt me. Why do I not deserve to also be hurt? But when you have a world that's built like that, it can be really challenging to get to a point where people can heal too. Because if you just think about the ways in which crime has happened, or like the response to a crime happening and the way our justice system serves people, some folks who need, justice, quote, which is what apparently our system gives people,
Yeah.
which we we know it doesn't. But it's shown time and time again that people sometimes will try and seek justice the quote unquote right way, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't actually heal whatever hurt was caused. It's them working on that hurt and working on that healing through what that meant for them, and that person being held accountable in ways that actually make the person who was harmed feel good, feel like, I am able to recover and heal from this.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean it won't be hard. It doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, but it's essentially showing the humanity in people, all people. When I think of abolition versus reform, is just like trying to fix a broken system.
I wouldn't even say it's broken. I think it's working the way it's supposed to work. I
Mm-hmm.
think like
Yeah.
there's nothing broken about our quote unquote criminal legal system, Like
Yeah.
as we talked about at the beginning of this episode, like the state is here to terrorize folks. The police are rooted in the commodification of Black livelihoods. And so I would even say that reform, to an extent, if you look at it from an abolitionist lens, it's just giving more credibility
Mm.
to this system. And when you
Right.
come at it from this abolitionist lens, you understand that the roots, that the whole entire basis of this system is to hurt people. It is to
Yeah.
separate people. It is to create two different classes. It is to keep those that are poor, that are Black, that are brown, that are indigenous, to make them less than the white elites, to protect, like you said, property rather than to protect the humanity within our communities. I think you also brought up something important when you were sort of drawing the line between reform and abolition, and how reform is tinkering around the edges, not really wanting to at all actually solve the root causes of these issues. And then abolition is coming at it with that radical love. But what is radical love? Because I think that's hard to identify because we've been taught to separate one another, to create a hierarchy of good doers and wrongdoers. But when you look at
Right.
life from an abolitionist end, there is no wrongdoers or good doers. You are looking at humanity. You were
Yeah.
looking at how can individuals support one another? How can we create systems that are rooted in that radical love? How
Mm-hmm.
can we reimagine a society, which people have been doing for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, Black radicals, especially, indigenous folks, really. um, these peoples, these thinkers, these thought leaders, it's not anything new reimagining. This radical love, it's not new. It's just something we have to root ourselves in to strip back that commodification that we have internalized, that capitalism that we have internalized. And I really am grateful whenever we get to have a conversation, whenever these conversations are brought up, whenever we ourselves bring up these conversations, because we get to talk about something that is better. So maybe we should talk about what is better, what comes afterwards. We've talked vaguely about it, but like Addison,
Mm-hmm.
what are some structures that you would like to see? What are some changes that you think would be an abolitionist approach to things?
That's actually like a really good question. And the best way I can describe it for me, how I think it would look to see these structures that, really promote humanity and healing and accountability, I think would be to look at the way the relationships in the community kind of work. I think building that community.
Mhm.
aspect is super important because if you think of in a lot of ways, indigenous folks, black and brown folks, community has kind of always been at the heart, right? A lot of work that I see people do, whether it's in talking about history, talking about abolition, just whatever the work they do, and it's around like community and understanding it, how it looks, it's always talking about how people take care of each other. And I think that that's a really important piece when we're thinking of these different systems. Right now, it's not necessarily good to think of the community, right? It can be as simple as an issue as universal healthcare, right? It is really at the basics just making sure everyone can have healthcare no matter what the cost is. And, of course, there are systems where, that works, that doesn't. But
Mhm.
when people are like, I don't want to pay for somebody else's healthcare, that just shows that it's not about us. It's about me and getting my needs met. Thinking of these systems, you want to think of, you know, what works for the community? What does the
Mhm.
community need? How are we ensuring that healing is happening? How are we ensuring that accountability is happening? What does rehabilitation look like after accountability? And not thinking of, well, what rights do you deserve because you did something wrong? Because when you define someone by their past, what change do you expect to happen
Absolutely.
when anything they do, anything they say, whatever changes they try to make in their life, they're always going to have a mistake with them forever. And I think when you do that, that again dehumanizes someone, and that doesn't really recognize that they are a person who makes mistakes. And I
And
think that that's something important to think about. It's just that, like, we're all people, we all make mistakes. And when you're having these conversations, because for me, I don't work as much in policy when it comes to abolition, but
Mhm.
thinking of it on the community level, it's hard to want to try and reimagine a system where in order to for me to reimagine it and work towards that reimagined system, there has to be a lot of community accountability and love that it's there, it's there, but it needs to be like a collective thought. I feel like
Totally.
for me to be able to truly see these systems changed and just like gotten rid of for ones that really do promote those other pieces I talked about before.
Absolutely. We'll need a mass, multi-generational, multiracial, multi-ethnic, international movement to take down the prison industrial complex because it's so ingrained in our economic system, in every single system that we hold, um, that is in place today. To sort of get back to the question that I had posed about what comes afterwards, I really appreciate like you not only talked about okay, like it's things like universal healthcare, of course, but it is about that collective thought of the community, having that deep conversation about what do we need. But I also think there's another point because I come from a low income community, and I know that you know that perspective as well. But I think about it's not only violence be like interpersonal violence between one group and another within our community or one individual and another individual. It's about how the state has perpetuated that. And I'm not
Hmm.
just talking about like through policing itself or through prison because as we both know like abolition is much much larger than that and deeper than that. But I really think about how the state has perpetuated things like homelessness, like the commodification of health, the commodification of something like water. The fact that it can be privatized, that the state charges us something for, is absolutely baffling to me. And I think abolition tackles those things. I think it breaks down this narrative that we have through capitalism of the owner of land or the owner of water, the owner of basically if you can afford to live or not, whether it be through
Yeah.
housing practices, through healthcare practices. So I think if we're looking at prison and police abolition, and in the context of the gun violence prevention movement to tackle gun violence at its core, we have to start tackling some of those economic issues. We have to stop charging people for things like healthcare. Even beginning that conversation of like, what does the right to housing look like? Because I
Yeah.
believe in that right to housing, but I don't have the policy solution, specifically working within this capitalist framework, which
Yeah.
we know with abolition, like we can't have capitalism because, as I've mentioned 9 million times now, it's the commodification of human life and human livelihood. We have to tear down systems and rebuild ones like on top of it from those
Yeah.
crumblings with that community need, like you said, of universal healthcare systems, of communal ownership of land, communal ownership of housing product, communal worker-owned collective businesses.
Yeah.
Um, so individuals don't go homeless. Individuals don't live in poverty. That is abolition work. I think that connects to gun violence because, at least I know in my experience, a lot of the violence within my community comes from those economic hardships. And
Yeah.
I could think about how many like instances of gun violence in my community could have been prevented if individuals didn't have to resort to atypical means, to violent means, to gain some sort of wealth within the community, to gain some sort of income. And I think that connects deeply to my own
And
struggle and
yeah.
my family struggle.
And, when you were talking, I was thinking about specifically, it just triggered a thought when you said the, commodification and privatization of water. When we're thinking of abolition, I think there are small ways in policy that people can get to
Mhm.
that. It's hard. I think like this system is hard to work in and try to work through for sure. And even though voting can be very powerful, it can also be inaccessible. There's also evidence that
Absolutely.
people have been suppressed from voting. So it's not necessarily, the end all be all to getting work done. But especially thinking of decriminalization efforts, one, we're thinking of the decriminalization of sex work, of people doing drugs, or those who, consume drugs. There's just so many things like even homelessness can be
That's a
illegal. It can be, there's just so many things that when we're talking about marginalized individuals and when it comes to policy, they're usually the ones that are negatively impact almost all the things that this system is supposed to have people be or do, it does. And those items or those things usually tend to be illegal, right?
yeah.
Even if you think about like the legalization of marijuana, right? There are millions of black and brown individuals who are in prison right now for
Mhm.
marijuana offenses. Meanwhile, there are white folks who are making a business out of
Oh
selling
yeah.
weed right
Yeah.
now, who are making so much money. Like they're pretty comfortably living. Meanwhile, when black and brown individuals were doing those things, it was deemed as a bad thing. But they
Absolutely.
were just trying to get food on the table or trying to get their
Mhm.
kids to school or just trying to pay the bills. Like the reasonings were for survival because it's not
Mhm.
like jobs are going to be hiring black and brown folks because these education systems are inaccessible. Literally all of these systems of oppression are so interconnected and they end up benefiting each other. If you think about it, racism, capitalism, white supremacy, homophobia, and just like the patriarchy, like all of these different things, what they end up doing is they just benefit each other in order to get a profit
Mhm.
for white folks, essentially. Because if you think about it, a lot of the drive is for money and for power, and that money and power, people are willing to put black and brown bodies on the
Yeah.
line in order to do that. Whatever that looks like, whether it's slavery, whether it's prisons, it's always the black and brown folks doing the work for free that
Yep.
white folks are able to benefit from.
Absolutely. I think you pinpointed some specific policies that progressives, that leftists, that abolitionists should be supporting, really, because it starts to break down the police state, the prisons that we have within the United States. And it makes noise around the world, really, because sadly, for a very awful reason, the US is looked upon as highly, which I do not agree with whatsoever. Quote me on it. I know this is probably going to bite me in the ass someday, but I don't fucking care. I'm dedicated to abolitionist work. But like you pinpointed these policies that could lead to massive change, like the
Yeah,
decriminalization of sex work and drug use,
yeah,
ending cash bail, of thinking about ways in which we can tackle the housing crisis in America. So individuals
hmm,
don't have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars to live. Housing is a necessity. Safety, shelter is a necessity. We should not have a system that is profiting off of necessities, but that
yeah,
we do, um,
yeah.
like you said.
Yeah, I think it's especially as we're thinking of because prison and police abolition, it's a pretty in-depth and complex topic because there's just you have to understand the different systems of oppression and how they kind of work together. Because to me, the way that I view gun violence, I usually view it as a symptom of all of these
hmm
systems. And a lot of the work that we're doing, like these decriminalization efforts or trying to work in policy, is to really just break down police and power of prisons
Absolutely.
as we see them today. I just think it's really important when doing abolition work to understand the different complexities of it, and then bringing that work into the context of GVP. It's just like
Absolutely.
really understanding what it means to do GVP work while thinking of these systems Because when you take that framing and really
Mhm.
bring that lens of, how do we get rid of this symptom,
Mhm.
which is how I see gun violence. It's one, a
Absolutely.
symptom, but also it's been a tool of power. So it's kind of twofold. So how do you take this symptom? What are the ways to get rid of this symptom, and what are the ways to change that symptom power dynamic for those
Yeah.
who've been able to use it?
Absolutely. And to sort of hone it back in, because I think you've done a great job of like honing it back into the GVP space instead of just talking about these very large ideas.
Hmm.
To sort of hone it back in for the listeners, I want to bring it back to my own personal story because, like, I think getting to the point where I thought that my uncle's murderers, I don't think they should be in prison. I think that was a big turning point for me because I started to question, well, why did they have to do that in the first place? Well, my uncle and the individuals that had shot and killed him, they were both forced into a system where they had to sell drugs to make some sort of income because their day jobs didn't provide enough. And I asked myself, okay, in order to solve gun violence, and I know it comes with low socioeconomic status, like having, for lack of a better term, low status as a low income person. Yeah, I frame that very weird, but I think people
Words are
understand what I
hard.
mean. They are very hard.
Words are
But
hard.
like, I think gun violence prevention organizers really need to understand about these root causes, and that's where a name comes from this episode, really, from this idea of this episode. That my uncle, to me, I don't think he would have been shot and killed if he was making enough money at his day job, if it was collective ownership over the means of production, if he had the capability to say, I need this X amount of money to survive. I want to live in a system where housing is a right, where healthcare is a right, where education is a right for every single person. And there's no differences in that level. That no matter if you're black, brown, if you're worker, if you're non-working, you still have access to every single system because you are human. I genuinely do not believe that these prisons, the police itself, these systems, these politicians, I don't think they understand that when we tackle the root causes, or maybe they do understand, they just don't give a fuck. And honestly, that's probably more likely. But I guess I want more GVP people to understand, more gun violence prevention organizers to understand that when we tackle these root causes, the threat of gun violence will go down so much. Out of the depths of my heart, to every gun violence prevention organizer listening to this, I need you to understand that the struggle for police and prison abolition is connected greatly to the struggle to end gun violence. So please, please, please educate yourself, whether it be through great resources like Critical Resistance, like Good Kids Mad City, Youth Over Guns, Decrim DC, um, so many amazing organizations. There's so many resources at yourself. So connect your local work. Have
Hmm.
these conversations. Knock on doors, of course, when COVID is a little bit better. But have these conversations and build that collective movement of working people. Build that movement within your society to democratize every single angle and to build that collective trust to really break down the power of the state and the power of violence by the state.
Yeah, I realized we talked a lot of big concepts. We've talked about a few, tangible pieces because I don't really think talking about these broader systems is it's like big idea because we kind of interact with them on a day-to-day basis, but like bringing it even more into that conversation around GVP organizing. I think you can see this now with work that Black Lives Matter has been doing, and just historically when we think of police and gun violence, they are one of the larger perpetuators of gun violence.
Mm-hmm.
For If you look at like people to people, it's kind of astonishing how often for this system to be quote unquote protecting us, people are hurt and killed by it. I think that for me, what's been very interesting in organizing within GVP in an abolitionist lens, it's that, you can't really talk about gun violence prevention work without talking about police and prisons because they end up just perpetuating gun violence
Absolutely.
in some sort of way. So I think that when we're thinking of police and prisons, it's understanding that the reason why we need to talk about it within GVP work is that they are a system that perpetuates gun violence. And when we don't admit that, we will never be able to solve gun violence because when you're not really analyzing the different systems that perpetuate violence, then you're never going to really understand, how to solve gun violence
Mm-hmm.
because you're ignoring one of the systems that are working to continue to perpetuate gun violence.
Absolutely. And I think you hinted at a point. I think we need to call it out just
Mhm.
plainly. And I thank Andrea. I
Oh,
absolutely I
yeah.
love Andrea. She said something at the summit, and I think Dawood might have as well, about how gun violence prevention organizers and large gun violence prevention organizations, I'm not going to name any names, and honestly, myself too, I have to be honest, like, we've perpetuated a police state. Gun violence prevention organizers, the gun violence prevention movement has perpetuated police state, and that's not right. I think about so many youth where we've been taken advantage of by these larger organizations to fight for bills that, yes, stop guns from getting in the hands of individuals that could cause harm, but it also gives more power and money to the police state. I think of efforts specifically around, oh, why am I blanking? There was a specific policy that I think needs to be talked about, plain and simple: extremist protection orders.
Mhm.
It sounds very great, and it does do a decent job of tackling the issue of gun violence. But when you give more power to the state, when you give more power to the police, to the prison industrial complex, you are allowing for another perpetuator of violence to really be upheld. And I think gun violence prevention organizers, and especially young gun violence prevention organizers, we need to start questioning larger organizations when they ask us to lobby for a piece of legislation. And extremist protection orders is only one example. There's literally hundreds. Nearly every single gun policy we have in the book, understandably, because we're working within this framework of capitalism, of the prison industrial complex, of the military industrial complex, of the commodification of human life. A lot of the policies related to gun violence prevention give more money and give more power to the police. And I think as organizers, we have to start questioning organizations that are supporting these policies.
I think it's also worth when we're thinking of policies. It's just when you're engaging or you're just like new to gun violence organizing, it's always important to do research, I think, and not just like research like googling something or watching YouTube videos, but asking people who do the work. Maybe watching a really boring I don't know what they're called, like whenever they talk about bills and stuff, because brain is blanking. But like being able to like kind of try and understand these things as best as possible, and not being afraid to ask questions, because I think especially with abolitionist work, there's a connotation that comes with it, and sometimes it's working through those connotations of abolitionist work is usually seen as a bad thing, or it's demonized, but it's really just about taking systems that have never been for the well-being of marginalized folks and creating a system that promotes the rehabilitation and accountability and healing of marginalized individuals in a very equitable way. And I think that, as we continue to do the work that we're doing, it's going to be really important to continue that education piece and be
Absolutely.
willing to educate others who may not be as well versed as we are. And I like definitely implore folks who have that ability and who have that capacity to be educating their community members. If you have access to resources that can help break down what this work means and what it looks like, being able to give those to folks and share those resources. Because the more we educate each other about what's going on and educate each other in ways that are accessible, the more people we can get to really help, not just in a political way and in a policy specific way, but in a community way, like bringing those two pieces together to create a just, an actually just, and equitable society that really does ensure that, we're not working for profit, but we're working for the sake of just working for each other,
Absolutely.
and working for our community.
You brought up the point of like giving resources and educating yourself. And I want to pinpoint for our listeners one of the best organizations, if that is a thing, one of the best like movement based groups that I've seen come out with some pretty easy to read and tangible, very easy to read, understanding resources is Critical Resistance. If you go to criticalresistance.org, you click on resources. There's abolitionist tools, abolishing jailing, abolishing police, addressing harm, accountability, and healing. All of these
Hmm.
things. There's videos, there's graphics. It's probably been one of the best organizations that has helped educate me within the last year, really. So please, 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 if you're listening, if you're a gun violence prevention organizer, if you're just a listener, if you're a friend, a family member, please go to that website, and they break down differences between abolition and reform, and what comes afterwards. And it's absolutely beautiful. So please, please, please. There's also a bunch of different organizations, but I highly recommend that one.
So I think, to kind of like end on a really good note, or at least in this really large conversation around this concept and the systems, and kind of bringing it back to how they kind of work with us individually. What would you say has been some skills or ways in which you've internally worked on radicalizing yourself and being able to kind of dismantle these systems in your own day-to-day life and be able to reimagine new systems?
Yeah, I thank you for asking that question because I think it's something we need to think about both as a community and individually. But when I really started to question, I started to ask the why. Why should there be a difference between someone who is black, who is white? Why should someone have the right to housing if they have wealth while there are thousands and thousands who are homeless? Why do I want to live in a world where I have friends and family members, and myself included, that don't know if we're going to be able to pay our rent? Family members that go hungry. Myself, who in high school would open up a fridge, open up a fucking cupboard, and would see a box of Triscuits and a few cans of like miscellaneous beans. Like that's not what I should be opening my shelves to. I should be opening my shelves to fresh bread, fresh produce, and that's the type of world that I imagine with abolition. And it literally is about to bring me to tears, but that's what's possible when we work for abolition. That is possible when we try to build a world that is just, that is equitable, like you said, Addison. And I think as a gun violence prevention organizer and as someone who has tried to chip away at the prison industrial complex, I've asked myself why. Why am I currently living in a world that is perpetuating harm against folks? Also, too, I think it's important to talk about how we actively engage in policing at an individual level too, because I think that's part of breaking down the prison industrial complex. Asking
Hmm.
ourselves, why are we judging someone for the way that they look? Why are we fat shaming someone? Why are we skinny shaming someone? Why are we judging someone for their hair, for their teeth, for if they have a house or not? So, as a gun violence prevention organizer, I hope if you're listening, to start asking yourself those whys, and just start consciously making the effort to break down those internalized systems of classism, racism, and so many others. How about you, though? How do you think you've radicalized yourself internally and externally, breaking down those systems?
I think for me, like going back to earlier, talking about love and what that looks like, I have faced a lot of trauma perpetuated by others and a lot of harm perpetuated by others. And when I think of abolition work, I always like to think of the way that I think of my process and how I really got here. I think about all the hurt that like has been caused to me and that I've experienced in my life that's resulted in the trauma that I've experienced. Being able to think about what would a world look like to heal from that. Because I think what ends up happening, especially when we talk about abolition, it's, well, what do we do when someone hurts us? And sometimes the answer is, you know, you do what you need to
Mhm.
heal from that. And when that process includes another person because of the harm they caused, it's looking like, what do I need to heal from this that won't cause more harm? Because I think that to me, prisons and police just, it's not about healing and it's not about accountability. It's just about harming people and punishing
Mhm.
people. And I think we need to think of those things differently as on a community level because when we think of that on a community level, it makes pushing for those policies a lot more understandable. It makes understanding these systems a lot more contextual because if we're living in a world that doesn't prioritize everyone, and doesn't love everyone and cares about everyone, I don't think that that's a world I could willfully live in
Mhm.
and continue to be a part of because it's hard to do. It's very hard to do,
Absolutely.
but it's worth doing if I care about the humanity of others, and care about the way in which people I love and care about navigate the world as well as myself and people I don't know. Just knowing that it extends to more than just my circle of people, but any and everyone, because every and anyone is a human being. I think they deserve those same rights and that same love that I would extend to a family member or a friend or someone I just care deeply about.
Absolutely. And thank you for like being honest throughout this conversation because I know we've talked about it probably 9 million times, and like so as like everyone in Not My Generation, specifically the board of directors and our committees. So thank you for always engaging in this space.
Yeah.
I kind of want to ask you to sort of end on a positive, on a hopeful, on a beautiful note. I just want to ask you, in one word, could you please describe a world free from policing and prisons?
One word.
Yes, one
Um,
word.
for me, I'd have to say love. Yeah, for a lot of the reasons I said, um, I'd have to say love.
Addison, I'm literally going to start crying because it just makes me feel this immense amount of community and of hope because there's so many individuals that just want a world with love in it. No matter where you come from, people at the end of the day, we just want community and love. And that is the world that abolitionists are trying to build. And we are trying to build that. Not My Generation is trying to build a youth over guns, good kids, med city, individuals, abolitionists that did work hundreds and hundreds of years ago. They were trying to build that, and we're continuing that struggle. So thank you, Addison, for being in community with me, for having this open dialogue. I genuinely, I do love you because I care about you. I really, really do, Addison. And we are going to change the world. Us
Yeah,
and the millions of other people out there who support this call.
yeah, I think we, and when I say we, I mean anyone and everyone engaging in the work in whatever way it looks like, are going to be able to create this world that we want to live in for future generations. And I want to thank you also for being in community. The more the merrier. I really did enjoy this conversation, and I hope that people really understand the connections between police and prison abolition and gun violence prevention work. And I'm thankful that Not My Generation is one of many, 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 many organizations, even more than we listed here, and individuals that are having this conversation. So I appreciate having this space and being able to do that as well. Thank you for listening to episode 9 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast where we discussed prison and police abolition in the fight to end gun violence. Please join us next Tuesday for an episode on the connection between climate justice and gun violence prevention.
In solidarity, Elijah Nichols
And Addison Moore.